Please feel free to go. And this morning, I'm going to go to the Gospel of Luke because it's Remembrance Sunday. Get a little break from the book of Revelation. And the title of the message today is Making a Sacrifice. When we look at the Gospel of Luke, it's a gospel, it's authentic, it was written somewhere between 59 to 63 AD. Luke himself's a physician, he's a historian, and when you look into it, you get the birth and the early ministry of Jesus. Then you get this Galilean ministry from chapters 4 to 9. We read about him feeding 5,000, being transfigured. We read many of the stories, the parables that he gives, like the Good Samaritan in chapter 10. He teaches us about prayer in chapter 11. And of course, there's warnings in chapter 12. He's teaching on the way to Jerusalem. Jesus knows that he's making a journey where he himself will die. He's going to become a living sacrifice on the cross. And so he's teaching his disciples about the cost of discipleship in chapter 14. And then he talks about the lost sheep and the coin and the son in 15, about Lazarus in 16, and about forgiveness in chapter 17. He talks about parables. There's so much going on. But in chapter 20, he has this clash with the religious leaders. And here we are today, 21st century Europeans. We like our comforts, but we greatly dislike sacrifice. My grandparents sacrificed so much. After the war, they felt they could not have a second child because it was so difficult financially. They were still rationing food. And we don't like that concept of sacrifice anymore. Sometimes I'm guilty of it as well. But most people who choose not to follow the Lord do so because it involves sacrifice. When you follow Jesus, it involves sacrifice. And yet, a sacrifice isn't a sacrifice unless it costs you something. David was given a piece of land. You read this in 2 Samuel 24, verses 24. And if it's too hot, feel free to turn the radiators down. If you want windows open, feel free to do that as well. And David was given a bit of land, and because he wanted to sacrifice things to God, and he said, I will not take something that has cost me nothing. And God has called us all as Christians to become living sacrifices. That's what it says in Romans chapter 12. That is a reasonable service, to become living sacrifices for God. Now I want to tell a story. It's not a real story, but it's a story with a point. Jesus told parables, and sometimes stories have got good points. I know in the scripture that a donkey did speak. Balaam's donkey did speak. But this story involves a pig and a chicken. They're walking down a village street and they saw a sign. In fact, it was a church sign advertising a special breakfast at 8:30 one morning on, I think it was a Saturday morning. And the chicken, at the bottom of the menu, it read bacon and it read eggs will be served. And so the chicken turned to the pig and said, see, even we can help the work of the church. And the pig said, yes, but yours is only a contribution. Mine's is a total sacrifice. So there's a point there. I know it's not a real story, but there's a point, and I hope the point comes across. Some might contribute, and in the great word, some contributed, but some became living sacrifices. And then chapter 20, Jesus went to the temple. There are various topics being discussed about the wicked wine dressers, taxes to Caesar, about marriage and the resurrection, whose descendant Jesus was. He was a descendant of David. And the religious leaders are trying to set traps. They want to kill Jesus, so they're setting these traps, and yet in all their wisdom, it falls apart. And so this incident that we're reading about today in Luke 21 is about the widow's two mites. And Jesus he's teaching there in the temple, as we mentioned. He's warning the people about the scribes and the religious leaders. But if you walked into the temple, there was an area called the court of the woman. And in that court, there were 13 receptacles or containers in that area where you would put money into. It was for the upkeep of the temple. So given the numbers at this time, it was Passover, there would have been people queuing up in lines. And so I want to talk to you about this one particular woman there in Luke 21, verses 1 to 4. I want to talk about this woman, and just to summarize the story before we look at it. This woman understood the principle of sacrifice. Remember, she's a widow, and sometimes we forget the war widows. Sometimes we forget the children that were orphaned by the wars. In fact, the rich were putting their gifts into the treasury, and Jesus sees this poor widow woman. She put in 2 very small copper coins. She put more in than the others. And yet all these people gave out of their wealth, but this woman gave out of her poverty, everything. So let's look at 3 observations this morning. The first observation was seen. The first observation was seen by Jesus. The second observation was the size of the offering. And the third observation is the sacrifice. So let me just read Luke chapter 21 for you and get the first verse. And it says this, and he looked up, that's Jesus, looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury. And please don't think as I bring this message before you that I'm telling you to go and sell up your house and everything and put it into the mission work of God. Well, if God puts that in your heart, that's a different story, but I'm not saying this, and this is not what the story is about. It's the story has got a point, and it's got a point about sacrifice. So the first observation, Jesus looked up. Obviously, Jesus' head must have been bent down. You can picture him in the temple. I don't know if he was putting money into the offering, but here, when he looked up, he saw the rich giving their gifts into the treasury. They might have went putting things into different containers. But Jesus is interested in giving. And sometimes the church, sadly, sometimes focuses always on giving about money. But giving can be about our time. Giving can be about our energy. Giving can be about giving our talents. Giving can be about so many more things than just money. But Jesus sees every part of our life. Notice that Jesus observes this. He sees every part of our life. He sees the intentions of our heart. And just because you might hide something from Jesus, it doesn't mean that Jesus doesn't see it. After all, Jesus sees absolutely every area of your life. And when you give sacrificially. And see, giving, this giving is something to do with obedience. Jesus is never too busy to notice your sacrifice. Sometimes we do things for God, and sometimes people don't see that. But Jesus sees. He saw this woman. Don't forget there was a crowd. He saw this woman in the crowd. But God doesn't call us to sacrifice for the sake of sacrifice, but as a response of obedience. Sacrifice for the sake of sacrifice is stupidity. Maybe you have sacrificed for years out of obedience to God. Maybe it's gone unnoticed. But the Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. It says in Psalm 44:21, would not God search this out, for he knows the secret of the heart. And it's to obey is better than sacrifice. That's what it says in the scripture. And it's interesting that this is the final incident before Jesus would himself become a sacrifice on the cross. Of course, he speaks to his disciples about the end times, but this is a public encounter we're talking about. And so Jesus sees something in this woman that's willing to give absolutely everything. And like our servicemen, like our great-grandfathers or our descendants who went to war to give everything, Jesus sees this in this woman. And he notices it. Now this tells us that Jesus is passionately cares about our sacrifices or the lack of them. He cares about what you have given up for the gospel. When you've given more. The time that maybe you give extra to help someone in need. The time that you might have given extra here. The time that you got out of bed and you prayed for the church. Or the time that you prayed for someone. Jesus could have taken his time and done other things. He could have spent more time teaching or praying. But he takes the time to notice the sacrifice of this one widow woman. So that's the first observation. It was seen by Jesus. But the second observation, get it up here? The second observation was the size. Let me read verses 2 for you here, so you can follow on the story. And he saw also a certain poor widow putting in 2 mites, just 2 mites. When we talk about size, in that society, a woman was really looked down upon. The religious leaders were divorcing their wives because they had burnt their bread or whatever. There were flimsy reasons why women were pushed aside. And Luke, he pays particular attention to women in his gospel, if you study the gospel of Luke. And so there's this woman, and she's a poor woman, and it was the worst kind of poverty. It's poverty that we probably don't even realize exists. And in fact, when you read it in the Greek language, there are 2 Greek words that describe this poor person's poverty. And one of those words describes the peno. It describes toiling for daily subsistence, living day by day just to survive. And the other word describes a beggar, someone that is completely destitute. So this woman was so poor, not just one word about poverty is used, but 2 words are used to describe her. After all, she was a widow. The only source of her income, her husband, was gone. It's not like today where a lady or a woman can go and get a job. In those days, that was almost impossible, especially if she's well on in years. So she's a woman. But we also notice that she's a widow. She's a widow that has no benefits, no medical cover, no food, and she gave absolutely everything. If there was anyone that had an excuse not to give, it was this widow who gave her all. We hear sometimes great excuses when people make excuses not to give. I'm broke, but too many bills, I'm struggling. You hear these excuses. But God is not impressed by excuses because they don't work with him. After all, because of our excuses, sometimes we miss out on the privilege of sacrificing something for God, whether it's our money or it's our time or our energy. And when you do something for God, God always blesses it. But then we think, 2 mites. That's what it says. It says 2 mites. What was the worth of these coins? How much did the widow give? It's not possible to give an exact figure. Some scholars would tell you it's probably about 50 pence or less. Some would say it's 1/15 of a day's wage, which is probably around about £5. So between 50 pence and £5. We know that we can't get a lot for that today. You might get a meal deal somewhere if you're good at getting the best deals. And so these 2 mites are copper coins. They're about 1/8 of a penny. And it was all she had to live on. So we can work out what she's got. And yet God measures our giving not on how much we give, but on how much it cost us. What the sacrifice involves. Now, she could have withheld what she had. Apparently, each container would have been used for different collections for specific purposes. So it's doubtful she would have just tossed the 2 coins in without thinking. She would have thought carefully. Therefore, it would have made sense for her to just give 1, wouldn't it? And you would advise her. I would have probably advised her, just give the 1, so at least you've got something, some food. In fact, Jesus wouldn't have been mad, and none of us could have been mad at this woman if she would have had something left. After all, this woman had many excuses to withhold the offering, But instead, she gave absolutely everything. So there we see the first observation. It was seen. The second observation we saw was the size. And the third observation and the last observation is in verses 3 and 4. And this is the sacrifice, what Jesus saw. Let me read verses 3 and 4 for you. So he said, that's Jesus, truly I say to you that this poor widow has put in more than all. For all these out of their abundance have put in offerings for God, but she out of her poverty put in all the livelihood that she had. So this is about participation. We can observe from this powerful incident that every one of us can give to God, whether it's money, time, our energy, whatever. We can all give. We're all capable of giving. If we want to give our lives, that is brilliant. That's what God loves the most, when we give our lives totally and completely to him. In fact, it is only our excuses that stop us participating in sacrificially giving. Therefore, one way of looking at this story is to consider the importance of participation. This was an important way of them expressing their gratitude for all that God had done. God had blessed them. God had saved them. God had delivered them. This was an important way to look at it. And when the containers were empty, this woman's 2 mites, or 50 pence, or £5, whatever it was, would have been part of the whole offering. And so what about the perception of all this? It's important to note that Jesus does not say that the rich were wrong in giving what they give. Probably they were giving what was required of them, but it might have been how they gave it. And there's no point in giving if your motives are wrong. And remember, in those days, they didn't have pound notes or bank notes or credit cards. It was coins. So maybe they were throwing the money into the containers to show how great they were. I would imagine that's what the kind of thing, because the way Jesus refers to these religious leaders, to show off. It's a display of showing, look what I'm giving. And yet the temple needed the support of the wealthy. Their contributions were important. However, it is about perceiving and understanding what it cost this woman to give her all. It's like our soldiers. Do we understand what it cost them on the battlefields of the Somme and the trenches? Do we understand what it cost them? Now, there was one obvious similarity between the rich and the poor person. The wealthy gave what they thought was suitable, and so did the widow. The difference is the rich gave out of their riches, and the widow gave absolutely everything. Can you imagine if I had £1 million, which would be really nice? I had £1 million, and I had £10, and I gave £10 to the offering at that time in the temple, and this widow woman comes up and she puts her 50 pence or £5 in. I would think, I've given more than her. But how do we perceive that? The widow gave everything. I would only be giving out my resources. Imagine if I could keep the £10 and give the rest of it into the offering. That would be a different story. Now, it's important to note what Jesus does not tell his disciples. He doesn't tell them to do exactly what the widow did. He did not say to them they should put everything they had into the offering, but one day he would require them to pick up their cross and to follow him and to die a death. And many of them did, except John. They were martyred. So they were going to give their lives. After all, this may have been the only time that this widow did this. It was an act of faith. She knew that the law required that the people of God would take care of the widows. The early church did that. And Paul writes a bit about it. And what she's doing is taking an act of faith and putting everything in, knowing that God would take care of her. Perhaps the problem was in the estimation of the onlookers. There's our 50 pence in there. Look at her. What's that going to do for the temple, or £5? What's that going to do? They might have despised her. The way Jesus talked about these religious leaders, I can quite imagine it. But Jesus sees something else. Jesus sees something more important. So how do we conclude? What sacrifice is God calling you to do? Yet obedience is better than sacrifice. God didn't call us to sacrifice beyond ourselves. If he didn't require us to sacrifice, nothing great would ever be achieved in life. Can you imagine those men not going to the war? Nothing would have been achieved. We could be under some dictator. And you can always measure how much someone cares about something by how much they sacrifice. This tells us a lot about God, because God cares about you. Because if he didn't care about you, he wouldn't have sent his son to the cross to die on the cross. So that shows us how important sacrifice was, that God sent his one and only son to die on the cross for us. It tells us God cares. It's interesting, there's a story in Korea, and this American went with his tour guide, and he sees, I believe it was South Korea, and I think it was before the split, but they see this old man and boy pushing a plow, taking turns about pushing a plow. And he thought it was rather silly. Why did they not get an ox? And the tour guide said, well, they did have an ox, but they sold it. And the man was shocked. Why did you sell your ox? Because the church needed it. People were dying and they needed all kinds of things, so they gave up the ox. And so they said that was a real sacrifice. They turned around and said to the American, they thought it was fortunate that they had an ox to sell. It's all about attitude. So as we prepare to mark Remembrance Sunday, there is a growing fear of forgetting the sacrifices that so many made. And thankfully, Jesus included the story of this woman who made that sacrifice. But let's not forget about those that sacrificed on the battlefields. 2 world wars left many widowed and orphaned at great cost. The brave men and women that served their country. Let's not let that disappear. My grandfather, I remember him telling me the stories in the trenches. When he was captured at St. Valerie, he turned around to give his friend, I think it was a match or something at the time, and when he turned around his friend, his head was blown off. These were real things that happened in history. Let's not forget the Canary Girls. Who can remember the Canary Girls? They served their country as well. These were female munition workers in the First World War. They were working with TNT, that dynamite stuff, which turned their skin yellow, and some of them even gave birth to yellow babies. Let's not forget the story of John Jack Travers, a young boy from Cornwall, went into the Navy at the age of 14. Kidding on, he was older. And then, when he was 16, May the 31st, 1916, His Majesty's ship, the Chester, at the Battle of Jutland, men were being killed all over the place, and he stayed on his gun while his friends and his comrades were dead and wounded around him. Let's not forget these things. Think of the Scottish missionary Jane Henning. She had spent many years as a matron in a Jewish orphanage in Budapest. There were 400 girls. Jane had the chance to leave. They told her to leave because the Nazis were coming in. They would have killed her. She was told that she would die, but she took care of those 400 Jewish girls. She was arrested, taken to Auschwitz, where she died at the age of 47. And we could talk about the Holocaust. There are so many things. So let's not forget these things, because sacrifice is important. That's why Jesus stopped to tell us the story of this widow woman. And what we see in that story is Jesus observes, and he saw the situation in the crowd. He saw the size of the offering. He saw the sacrifice. So this morning, let's not forget the sacrifice that so many made. And we thank God for his word as well. We're going to close this morning with our last song, and it's Be Thou My Vision. Ian's